Okay, so my name is James, and I am one of the staff attorneys here at Project Citizenship. So this training is going to go over some of the workshop basics. So you might have been assigned to AA or App Assistance or QC for quality control, and there will be a separate video for that. This is going to be just a shorter training for all of our volunteers that go over just some of the basic stuff, in our mission here at Project Citizenship. So for today's agenda, we'll talk a little bit about the challenge and what we do, but also citizenship eligibility criteria, and of course the workshop basics. So if we look at the numbers, there are many, many immigrants throughout the United States that are eligible for citizenship. Here in Massachusetts, we have around 210,000 of them, but we know only around 10% will succeed. There's a few reasons for that. I think primarily the exam. So there's an English requirement. You also have to pass a civics exam, which is like history questions. The cost of the application, so it's $760 if you don't have a fee waiver. This has 20 pages. It's actually 14 pages now. The form was recently changed, but it's still a longer form, and it asks just about every aspect of your life. And so it can be a challenge to sit across from somebody and be vulnerable and talk about those subjects. There's a lot of fear. So, everybody who's applying for citizenship, this isn't their first experience with the U.S. immigration system. And so, there might be some negative experiences in the past. And so it can be scary sort of putting yourself in that position again. And then finally, it's a long process. So we have 6+ months here. I think in Boston right now, if you look at the website, it says maybe 8.5 months, something like that. But we are seeing, you know, 5, 6, 7 months. Of course, it can take a lot longer than that, and it does for some people. And you don't really have a good idea of that going in, right? So it could be that you're one of the lucky people that gets through quick. It could be that you're waiting for over a year. And so it's a long, long process, and that should be taken into account as well. Okay, so eligibility criteria. So first and foremost, this is just going over some abbreviations on the green card. So the green card is super important, also known as the LPR card or lawful permanent resident card. You'll also see USCIS a lot on the green card, but also the application that stands for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's the federal government. That's who we're submitting these applications to, and that's who's making these decisions. So I went over LPR, lawful permanent resident, also N400. That's the name of the application for naturalization. There are some other applications, for instance, the N600. That would be for somebody who might derive citizenship from a parent. But these, the N400s for folks applying, that's who we're helping at these workshops. Um, and so that's what we'll use. If you look down at this green card, you'll see a few helpful things. So the USCS number or A number, that's going to be a 9-digit code on everyone's green card. That's going to have to be put on every application. So please be aware of that. But also the date of permanent residence, that's super helpful as well. So what is the basic eligibility criteria? So first and foremost, you do have to be 18 years old. You have to have been a permanent resident for the last 5 years or 3 years if you're applying based on marriage. Um, you also have to be physically present in the U.S. for at least half of that 5 or 3 years, and then continuous residence in the U.S. for the past 5 or 3 years. So that gets a little bit tricky. Really, I think it boils down to um, in the travel section of the application, what does that look like? Are people taking trips over 6 months? Are people taking trips over a year? I think in those situations, that could raise a red flag for eligibility. And then the other thing is, are they taking a bunch of small trips that are adding up to a long time? So it's those two situations. Big, big, long trips, keep an eye out for, but also, are there a lot of little trips that are adding up? And then, of course, and we'll get into this in the part twos, but we are walking around answering questions for the whole workshop. So that would be a time where you might want to flag us down. But again, we will get into that in the part twos. So you also have to have residence in the state where you're filing for at least 3 months. This doesn't come up too often, but it can be sort of a pain if somebody has just moved. So good moral character is a big, broad issue. That could be things like not paying taxes, or failure to support your dependents. But it could also be criminal history. It could be, um, uh, sort of anything related to fraud. But then also some of the more obvious criteria like basic understanding of English, reading, writing, and speaking, also understanding of U.S. history and government. So there's also a fee for citizenship, and I said that was $760 earlier. Our services are always free, so we don't charge anyone who comes through our door. But again, the government does charge a fee of $760 per application. There are fee waivers that are available. So the main one that we use the most is the means tested benefit one. So that means if somebody already has something like SNAP through DTA or Mass Health, so those are through like federal programs. So the government is saying we'll take your word for it. Just prove that you receive one of these programs, and we'll give you a fee waiver. So that's the easiest because we can just get an eligibility letter from one of these organizations. So you could also prove it based on taxes. So you could show that you're making less than 150% of the federal poverty level. That's another way you could qualify. There's a reduced fee waiver, so that goes up to 400% of the federal poverty level as well. And then also there's no fees for those who are eligible based on qualifying military service. So what is pre-registration? So every applicant that comes to a workshop has already, either called us or, you know, walked in and gone through a screening appointment. So we screen for eligibility requirements, derivative citizenship, right? If their parent was already U.S. citizen, they might have already derived, um, English language capability, criminal background, other good moral character issues, also potentially a medical disability waiver. Like these are conversations we're having before the workshop, and so we should have a good idea of, um, what that workshop appointment is going to look like, and if there are any, special considerations that we might need. So just be aware that these are conversations we're having ahead of time. So, what are the types of materials and support that's available to our volunteers? So, there's a few things. When you're in person at one of these workshops, you'll notice that we usually use like a desk setup. You can see in this photo, and we'll put all sorts of stuff on that table for you. First and foremost, right, the prepared client file. So that's going to have um, all of the stuff for that specific client, the screening information. There's going to be a place for notes, a photocopy of the green card, but also the application itself, right? We also include an annotated N400, so please don't fill that out. We printed on a different color paper, but that is just a copy of the application that sort of has notes throughout it explaining maybe tricky sections. Um, and be aware, we at the bottom here staff for questions, like we're walking around answering questions as well. So here we're just going to be talking about the role, and what it looks like and what are the responsibilities here. So keep in mind, right, in an ideal scenario, you may be the only attorney that talks to the applicant, right? They may complete the entire N400 without ever speaking with one of our staff. I think in many cases they might, right, because we're walking around answering questions. But on that day in particular, I think sure, right, an ideal scenario, they may get through 100% without speaking with a PC staff member. So remember, we want to review the client info page. So that's that piece of paper stapled to the inside of the client file. So you'll be able to see all sorts of information about them, but also it's a place for you to include notes and review the notes that were left by the app assistant. And again, you are critical in our mission. Um, and so we thank you so much for being a part of our workshops. you really do make it so much better for applicants. I mean, the success rate is you can't argue with it. So thank you. So where to start? So like I was saying, you want to open up the client file. You want to write your name on the inside left on that client info page. Um, there's a spot next to quality control. You'll see where the AA person hopefully put their name, and then you can sort of get started. You want to read all the notes on that page made by the app assistance volunteer, because that's going to sort of bring you up to speed the quickest, and it's going to give you an idea of what was completed at app assistance and maybe what wasn't, what was left out. So definitely add your notes and concerns as you review, right? Because we're going to be reviewing all of the notes, all of the app assistant notes, all of your notes when we review the application. Also, you sort of are positioned towards the end of the workshop appointment, right? And so you're going to be one of the last people that the applicant sees. And so if you know, hey, this person didn't have their travel dates, make sure that they're leaving with an understanding that they need to get travel dates. So, and that can just be, a conversation. So, hey, we're going to send you to checkout here in a sec. But just remember, make sure you send in the travel date so they can add that to the application. Something simple like that. And again, we're going to hopefully be going over that at checkout as well, but I think it goes a long way, sort of reinforcing that hey, there's extra steps here that we're going to need to follow. So does the applicant speak English? So English can come up at workshops. There are a few different ways someone could be, exempt from the English exam. But I think, for every person who is exempt, there's somebody who, unfortunately doesn't have an exemption. And so, if you have, an applicant and you're concerned that they don't speak enough English and you're not seeing, any available accommodation, right? They don't have a medical waiver. They're not hitting the age limit for the exemption. Then please alert one of our staff, and we can sort of have a conversation with them. We really don't want to be putting people in a position where they're wasting their money if we know to a reasonable degree that they're not going to be able to pass the test. Um, I think it becomes a different question when there's a fee waiver involved, because at that point we're only losing time. Um, but I think it's going to be a conversation with the applicant, and it's going to be the applicant's decision at the end of the day. And then again, this little note here: we can connect clients to ESL classes. So we do have different referrals, and so if there's a need for ESL, I think we can make sure that that person is leaving with some resources for sure. So another thing to note: the applicant must answer the questions. So please direct your questions to the applicant. Instruct family members and helpers not to respond for the applicant. And of course, sometimes that's not fully possible, right? There are cases where you really do need the help of a family member. That could be a medical waiver situation. But USCIS does take this stuff very seriously in the interview, and if they think a family member is answering for the applicant, they could kick them out. They could end the interview right there. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our best to prepare these people for the interview conditions, which can be very harsh. And so we want to do as much as we can in the opportunities we have. Um, okay. So, and then don't forget, if they have, make sure if they do have an interpreter that they have they qualify for an interpreter, and the interpreter should be interpreting each question and answer. So again, if it feels like maybe the interpreter is not fully interpreting, flag one of us down. We can have a conversation. So getting into the actual application here, um, this is the very first question. It's, if you've done this form before, this is a new version. It looks a little bit different. So you might be scratching your head. The important thing to note here is that for question one, A here, general provision, is the 5-year eligibility. So again, 90 something percent of people are going to be checking A. B is for the spouse of a U.S. citizen. So there are some folks who will be applying through their U.S. citizen spouse. So they'll be checking B, and we have that noted pretty clearly on that client info page. Uh, I think anything else on this page would be a very specific situation that we wouldn't see very often. And again, that would be noted clearly. We might even have a conversation with you about that if we flag that down. So again, keep in mind it's going to be A the majority of the time, maybe B, and then if it's any of the other options, um, that'll be we'll discuss that ahead of time. Okay, so for quality control, so if you are applying based on marriage, we want to be checking that the applicant has actually been married for the 3 years. So if they have a certificate, great, we can look at it, but just, we can also just ask these questions. Um, they have to have been a permanent resident for 3 years. So we can check that based on their green card. And then also we have to make sure that they've been living with their U.S. citizen spouse. And the U.S. citizen spouse must have been a citizen for that 3 years. So all of these sort of conditions have to overlap in these last 3 years. And if any of them don't, then the 3-year eligibility sort of falls apart. So the most common thing that can happen is separation. So even if there's no divorce, if a couple is married, living together, and they're satisfying these conditions, and at year 2, they hit a rough patch, someone moves out, that basically demolishes the 3-year eligibility. So we then have to wait for the 5-year, or we can reset the 3-year. But at that point, right, we might as well just wait. So that's a common one. But of course, if you get divorced, if any of this, sort of formula doesn't work, right? The marriage based eligibility doesn't work. So keep that stuff in mind, and of course, flag us down if you have any questions about that. So this is sort of going through the basic information. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I have a couple notes here. So for number 1, the current legal name, that's going to be the name on the birth certificate or the driver's license or maybe the passport. But keep in mind that the green card is often incorrect. So you might see misspellings, you might see abbreviations, and that's okay. But that would not be proof of the legal name. And I'd actually encourage you to include it in part 2. So, or not question 2, excuse me. So question 2 asks other names you've used since birth. So that's a place for aliases, nicknames, maiden names, things like that. But also, hey, did they spell your name wrong in your green card? That's a perfect use of that question. Question 3 goes over the name change. So if you filled this out in the past, it really hasn't changed. It's pretty simple. If you'd like to change your name, all you have to do is check yes and include that new name. One thing to note is that if there's some uncertainty about whether the applicant wants to change their name, they can wait till their interview, and it'll basically be re-asked then. So regardless of whether they check yes or no, they'll be able to either reverse that or continue with that choice at the interview. So nothing is sort of binding at this stage. And I find that often just like telling the applicant that makes them feel a little bit better about it, because it is kind of a big thing, right? Do I want my name legally changed? Because that's gonna, maybe I have to go get all my documents updated, right? So that can be it can have a big impact in somebody's life. So, more information about the applicant, online account number. We don't usually fill that in. It's possible an applicant might have one from a prior application, but we don't usually fill it in. Gender identity. Date of birth, date the applicant became an LPR, that's permanent resident, country of birth, and then also country of citizenship or nationality. There is a social security update. So in the past, you would just include the social security number. But if you became a citizen, it would be sort of up to you to update social security of your status change. So now you're given the option to check yes to a couple boxes, include your social, and they will update Social Security for you. So that I would recommend an applicant does this because I think it does make a difference. You hear many stories of people not updating Social Security, and then their benefits run out, and then it becomes a big hassle. And so I think this is beneficial, but of course it's up to the applicant whether they want to fill this out. So just a pause and quick quality control note, we want to double check all dates based on the green card. We want to add an addendum if information is wrong. So, for instance, if the date of permanent residence right is off, let's include an addendum that explains that. And then also keep in mind that you might see January 1st as a common date of birth. That's usually folks that maybe are former refugees. They may be stateless, right? And so that's a common reason to have a January 1st date of birth. So the medical waiver, um, some of you might be familiar with this. This is a separate form that we would have completed ahead of time by with the doctor, or the doctor would have completed it with us. Um, it's called the Form N648. So this would be noted on the client info page. It might be the reason they have an interpreter, right? But this is a form that will be adjudicated at the interview. And if it's not accepted, they have to take the tests. So you'll see here it's a plain question number 11. Again, this is something that we've done ahead of time. If somebody's asking about it for the first time at the workshop, flag one of us down and we can have that conversation. So resident. So this is pretty straightforward. It looks a little bit different, this new version, but realistically, we're just including all residents' information in the last 5 years, or 3 years if they're applying based on marriage. So remember, the applicant has to live in the state for 3 months prior to filing. So if someone has just moved here in the last couple weeks, they'd have to wait um, before they can apply. We want to avoid gaps in residence. So if you notice that there's a couple months in between residences, inquire about that. If there was no residence during that time, that's okay. But we do need to sort of make that clear by including a slot for it, basically. It does ask you dates of residence. So approximate dates are usually fine. Of course, we want the full date if possible, but I think if May 2024 is as good as we can get, that should be fine. And then we want to avoid foreign addresses, right? Because if somebody's been living in a different country, that means they might have given up their permanent residence, right? And so, um, if you do notice that, please flag one of us down so we can have that conversation with the applicant. Okay, so information about parents, part 6. So this question is really asking or sort of digging at whether the person might have derived citizenship from their parent. So if they're checking yes to this question, it's probably not a big deal because again, we've screened this ahead of time, and it's possible that you could check yes to this and not um, drive citizenship. But I think if they're checking yes, you want to inquire with these 3 questions below, right? So um, we want to know whether the applicant was under 18 at the time their parent became U.S. citizen, also whether they had their green card before they turned 18. And then finally, whether they lived in the US with their US citizen parent while under 18. So all those things have to happen at the same time. So if someone's checking yes to 10, ask about that. It's a little confusing. It can be tricky, and so feel free to flag one of us down to help out. Biographic information, it hasn't changed too much, and it's pretty straightforward. There's not too much here to note, but we do notice that question 2 is a little bit antiquated, and sometimes folks have issues with it. So I think the most common issue we'll see is someone will check yes to Hispanic or Latino in question 1, and they'll get to question 2 and go, I don't really feel like any of these options, I don't identify with any of these options. That's okay. So if that's the case, what we can do is just leave it blank. That hasn't caused an issue yet, so we'll continue to do that. Um, and yeah, if there's any questions also about any of these other questions and whether someone identifies with them, please let us know and we can discuss. So marital history, this is another section that has changed quite a bit if you've done this before. So um, it's been, I think, greatly simplified. So if you are applying, based on the 5-year eligibility, you're simply checking your marital status. If you are married, you're checking whether that person is a member of the U.S. Armed Forces. And then finally, how many times total you've been married. Remember, we count marriages, not spouses. So if someone has been married to the same spouse multiple times, it would be 2 marriages, not one. Um, Also, there's no such thing as legal separation in Massachusetts. So if somebody is checking separated, inquire about that because it's actually more likely that they are still married um, or they've been separated in a different state. So it gets a little bit tricky if you are applying based on marriage because now you do have to include some more information. So um, it's pretty basic, but you'd include the name of your spouse, the date of birth, the date of marriage. Do you share the same address, right? Because that's important. When did or how and when did your spouse become a citizen? Those sort of things. So um, I think usually people don't have a problem with this section. It's most, the issues that do occur are just, I don't remember, X date, like that sort of thing. Um, so, just keep that in mind. So also marriages can't overlap. So bigamy and polygamy are they're taken very seriously by the federal government. And so if you're noticing dates overlap, that could be a big deal. It's usually not. It's usually something simple, like there's an error. But it's something that we need to, certainly be on the lookout for. If the applicant is unsure whether they're married or divorced, you want to assume married. And then if they're estranged from their spouse and they don't have information, we want to assume that they're still married. But remember, right, the application based on marriage requires living together. It requires that U.S. citizen spouse um, being a U.S. citizen spouse for all those 3 years. So there's a few things that have to be checked. So information about children has also been sort of simplified. We're only listing children under the age of 18. So that, of course, includes biological children, adopted, and stepchildren, but only under the age of 18. So if you only have children over 18, we're writing 0. A couple of notes here. So residence is important just because we want to make sure that the person is supporting their dependents. And if USCIS sees a different address, they'll likely ask about that. Also, you can see to the farthest right column asks directly, do you support this child? And so if either that's being checked no or residence shows a different address, we want to ask a few more questions about whether they're actually supporting their children. Is there a child support order, right? If not, are we making payments regularly, right? Um, so those are the kind of questions we want to ask. Okay, so children continued. Ask if the child is a U.S. citizen. If the child is a permanent resident, include the child's A number. So there's no spot to do that on the application, but you can do it in the client info page. If the child is not a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident and they're living in the U.S., you might want to inquire about a potential smuggling issue. How did the child get to the U.S.? What was the applicant's role? Of course, that's a little bit more complicated, and so if you'd want, um, a PC staff member to have that conversation, that's understandable as well. So again, supporting children is super, super important to USCIS. It could be the reason you are denied for good moral character. And we've certainly seen that recently in the last few years. But it has to be a willful failure. So it can, there could be a reason that you are not supporting your dependents that is not willful. But I think that would be sort of up to you to prove that. There doesn't have to be any sort of formal court order or formal arrangement. The absence of that doesn't mean that you don't have to support your dependents. And then, right, willful doesn't include inability to pay. due to unemployment or financial circumstances or making a reasonable effort, but the family refuses assistance. Um, so we want to know why. So we want to always inquire why they're not paying. And then, I think in terms of proving payment, things like if there is no, support order, of course, I think things like bank records can be helpful, just to show that payments are going out regularly. So we want to inquire about all of that, and we want to make sure we're including an addendum if needed as well. So employment, this is very similar to residence. We're starting with the current employment and working backwards. 5 years or three based on marriage, right? So if we're noticing gaps between employers, we want to include unemployed as maybe its own individual section, right? I would say anything larger than a month. So if you're noticing, hey, the job ended May 1st and then the next job started in October, right? That should be its own section for unemployed. If the applicant is currently not working, we'd want to list that as well. So the very first thing would be either unemployed or retired or whatever the case might be, just to sort of demonstrate that. So travel history has been a little bit simplified. We're still including all travel in the last 5 years or 3 years based on marriage. We're starting with the most recent trip and working backwards. You notice here we don't have to include the travel date total. So in the past, you'd have to include like it was 50 days outside of the US, whatever that might be. Still, though, it's important to sort of keep track of that. Anything you notice that's more than 6 months, flag us down. Um, if you notice that, say there's a bunch of little trips that are adding up to maybe years and years, right? So that would be an issue as well that you'd want to flag us down for. Um, I think I prefer the passport stamps when I'm looking at travel personally. I know it's certainly not easy, but I think it's accurate. There's also a travel history website through CBP. It can be hit or miss, and so I don't think anyone would be expected to use that. Um, but I think stamps could be helpful. And of course, too, if you feel like it's just not possible to get through this section. I think this is like one of the most common sections that people can't get through. So feel free to, if it's taking some time, just put a pause on it and we can move forward. And then, worst case scenario, PC staff can always just track that information down after the workshop appointment. So absences of 6 months to a year can be a big deal. So an applicant basically it creates a presumption that they disrupted their continuous residence, and so they have to rebut that at their interview. So things that they can show, employment in the U.S., right? If they maintained a job, um, that they weren't working when they were abroad, immediate family that remained in the U.S., school records, affidavits, access to your home in the U.S. through a lease or a deed, that you filed taxes as a U.S. resident. Um, also things like payment. Hey, were you paying your cable bill? I think that's stuff we've used in the past. This can be a pain, especially with COVID too in the past. So um, we've seen many people that have taken short vacations that turned into long ones because all of a sudden they couldn't come back to the U.S. during COVID, and so that's something to consider as well. So we want to make sure we're including notes if anything's over 6 months, and we do have a warning handout that we'll give to the client as well. So if we see that note at checkout, we'll note to give that to them. So absences of a year plus are even more serious. So at that point, they would actually have to wait, unfortunately, for that enough of that trip to age out of the last 5 years, right? So here we're saying the applicant must wait 4 years and one day, or 2 years and one day if it's based on marriage, until they can apply. So anything over a year is even a bigger deal. So definitely flag us down, for sure. Okay, so good moral character. This is that section with all the yes or no questions. If we're checking yes to any question in this section, we should be including an addendum. So
I think it's, the keys to the section are breaking down complicated questions in understandable terms because these questions have the most difficult language to understand, especially if English is a second language. But remember, the period we're looking at, that's most scrutinized is the past 5 years or 3 years if applying based on a marriage. And then we're measuring against the standards of the average citizen in the community of residence. That's the standard that USCIS uses, and of course that fluctuates. And so if there are specific questions on that, feel free at the workshop to flag us down. So unlawful acts. So these include acts that are against the law or against moral or ethical standards. It's very broad. It doesn't have to result in a conviction. Um, it may not be a specific ground of deportability. Um, it doesn't have to fall under other statutory bars. So USCIS will consider the nature and the magnitude of the act as well as any mitigating or favorable factors. So false claims to U.S. citizenship. This is questions 1 and 2 in part 9. So and it deals with voting really, but no places in Massachusetts allow non-citizens to vote, at least right now. So I believe there's a bill that's working its way through that could potentially allow in specific circumstances, but not right now. And so if an applicant has voted, stop. Please alert one of us to come over and have that conversation. You know, write as detailed of a note as possible on the client info page because it can be really serious. Um, Anyone who has registered to vote but did not vote must unregister. So this is a little bit less serious. It's still a big deal. Um, but basically, we cannot apply until the person has been unregistered. Now, I think in practice, what happens is after a certain amount of time of not voting, you're purged. And so many times when we go to unregister somebody, they've already been unregistered. And usually this stems from a social studies class or something where they took the high school class to go register, right, for the election, and not knowing that people that were not citizens were not supposed to register. So um, yeses to these questions could be a big deal. So please flag one of us down. Um, but know that if it's just registering, we can unregister. So taxes are another good moral character issue. Really, it comes down to, do you owe any overdue taxes? If you do owe overdue taxes, it's not necessarily a huge deal. You just have to get on a payment plan with either the IRS or if it's Massachusetts, it would be the DOR. And you have to be making payments. So it's possible that you could currently owe taxes and still be eligible. Now, question 4 is a little bit complicated. It's asking if when you filed, did you file as a non-resident alien, essentially when you shouldn't have. That is, I think the problem with the question is more so that it just doesn't, it's complicated and doesn't really make a ton of sense to people. Um, and I think realistically, I don't know that there has been a tax form in the last 10 years that where this was like an option. Um, and so I think feel free to flag one of us down to sort of help out with this question. But realistically, it's asking, hey, did you misclassify yourself when you did file? And as long as they filed correctly, it shouldn't be a problem. So some occasional yes answers. So military and police units, um, weapons training, those two things are usually not a problem, but we would still need to include an addendum. Also, removal proceedings. So this is something we would have screened for ahead of time. So if it's not previously noted, please flag one of us down. It's usually not a big deal. There's usually some good reason, or maybe that's how they got their green card, right? But still, it's something that we need to be aware of. So we're filling out the application correctly. So military training specifically, this could include police and military in any country, and we're also including things like ROTC. So it's a very broad question. Again, usually not a problem, but if the applicant was involved in like specific military action against a government, that could be a bigger deal. So flag us down. Haven't personally seen that yet, but if you do, please again flag us down. Criminal history is also a tricky part of the application. Again, this is something we've screened for ahead of time. Um, and I think the chart is also kind of scary. And so something we've said in the past too is if you feel like you're not sure you can fill this out correctly or you have some questions, feel free to sort of skip over it too, because this is something that we're going to make sure is filled in correctly when we review. And so it might make sense to just let us do it if it's more complicated. If it's, simpler and it's just a charge or two, I think it's a little bit easier. Um, we also do include essentially the charge. If there are charges that need to be placed in this table, we include them in the format they would be placed on the client info page. So it would be, what was the crime itself? What was the date of the crime, the date of the conviction, etc. Applicants have to provide certified copies of dockets for any criminal charges. That's true, whether they're sealed or expunged or they happened 30 years ago, right? It doesn't matter. We also have to include them if they're dismissed. So it doesn't matter if they were convicted or not. We still have to disclose. And the questions are broad enough here that we're including things like moving violations and speeding tickets as well. We might include some pre-reviewed dockets in the file. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to do that just if there's a lot of them. But I think if there's a couple, we'll usually include them. And then anything that's newly disclosed, make sure to leave a clear note for us, and explain to the applicant as well that they're going to need to get that docket for us as well, so we can review it. So just a couple of notes. You want to include the crime as it appears on the docket disposition. And then if there's any question of motor vehicle history, like, tickets and things like that, inform the applicant that maybe the best bet is to just take their RMV record to the interview. If there's a question on how to get that, you can point them to us. There's like a way to request it through the RMV website or to make an appointment as well. But we find that's helpful if there's just a lot of uncertainty related to, motor vehicle issues. So this is just a list of potentially problematic crimes. So if you are being told about charges for the first time, these ones would be more serious than maybe others. So drug convictions are potentially the most serious. Any crime of theft or fraud, even if it's a minor shoplifting charge, firearms offenses, crimes of violence, violating protective orders, sex crimes, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, and then multiple OUIs in the statutory period, which is the 5-year period or the 3-year period, if applying based on marriage. So again, this isn't something that needs to be memorized, but if you are being told about charges, just try to keep this in the back of your head, and certainly feel free to flag this down as well. So material misrepresentations or false testimony, this would be like, you gave a fake visa to a border and customs official, right? It's possible this could, obviously this could impact eligibility. So we want to know as much as possible the nature of the lie, the reason for the lie, when the lie occurred, but also where it occurred. Because we're going to have to explain it, right? We're going to have to check yes to this, and then we're going to have to explain it in an addendum. So we want to know as much as possible, even if it means that we can't help this person, right? So do keep that in mind. And then also, this is, when someone applies for citizenship, this is USCIS's sort of last chance to look through their entire immigration history. And they're going to look at things like how they obtained their green card, whether it was employment or marriage or asylum or a sponsored petition. So we want to ask about that and make sure that everything lines up. And there's nothing that even seems kind of fishy, right? Because if we're seeing that, then USCIS will definitely see it. If it's through marriage, you might want to ask the status of that marriage. Anything that's less than 2 years could be suspicious. So this would be like, you got your green card through a marriage and then immediately divorced. That could be a problem. It could look definitely fishy to USCIS for sure. So selective service is a little bit tricky. I think really what you need to know is that anyone born a male, between 18 and 26 living in the US has to register for Selective Service. So if they're under 26, you want to or in any case, really, you want to verify if they registered first and foremost. There's a link placed at the top. If you just Google Selective Service, it brings you there pretty quick. And there's like a tab called Verify. You include the date of birth, the last name, and the social, and it'll tell you all you need to know, the Selective Service number and the date registered. It's very common that people don't remember registering. So they might have done it in high school, right? And they don't have any memory of that, and that's fine. So if they haven't registered and they're under 26, please make a note on the client info page because we can register them. If they're still under 26, that's something we can do. If they're between 26 and 31, we're going to complete the Selective Service addendum that we have. And please make a note on the client info page. The reason why 26 to 31 is its own category is because that means that your failure to register is within the last 5 years. Which is the period of eligibility, right? Or that's the period that's most scrutinized by USCIS. So if they're over 31, we're outside of that last 5 years, so that's great. We still need to include the addendum, explaining that they did not register. The oath of allegiance is sort of like the last part of the application. It's pretty straightforward. There is the full version on the last page, and so if the applicant is unfamiliar, you can show them that page. Couple things to note here too. So I think a common reason why someone might not want to check yes to these is the religious or moral exemption, right? So that would be you have a deeply held opposition to bearing arms, right? And a common one is Jehovah's Witness, right? That's something that we see a lot. So the opposition must be based on a deeply held moral or ethical code. You'd be bringing in a letter from your place of worship, right? Or a passage or something like that. I think if you just went in and said, I've never personally wanted to bear arms and I don't, I've never like that sort of thing. I don't know that they would accept that. It can't really be based on just personal preference. It has to be some sort of like deeply held, moral code. So in terms of final steps, part 11 is the applicant's signature. That'll be signed at checkout. Part 12 is interpreter information. So this should only be completed if there was an interpreter used. And then parts 13 to 16, please don't complete those. Those are for USCIS's purposes. If they are filled in, it's not a big deal. We can either wipe them out or replace the page, but just try not to fill that in. Okay, so this is the end of the presentation. So we want to thank you so much for volunteering. I'm sure many of you have volunteered in the past, but if this is your first time, thank you, thank you, thank you as well. If you have any questions about the workshop, please reach out to this email account, our volunteer account, and we should be able to get everything straightened out. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful time at the workshop, and I hope you volunteer many more times. Thank you so much.